Hey there, agile, slow moving herds of grazing giraffes, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bites, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. Today's topic comes to us inspired by one of our clients. Not too long ago, they decided that they were going to build up a QA practice. And as some clients do, rather than pay my coaching fee, they bought me whiskey and a cigar. And I will tell you that if you would like budget rate coaching from me, that is the way to do it. Buy me a whiskey and I will talk about whatever you want to talk about as long as you want to talk about it. So that's what they did. They had just brought on a person because they wanted to improve QA of their product, and they wanted to know what things should we be thinking about when we think about doing QA at an organizational level. What does that look like? And so we talked about that. And I thought today what I would do is give you a very, very condensed version of the things that we discussed. So first of all, let's talk about what QA, quality assurance, is in software development, because traditionally, at least the organizations I've worked with over the years or worked for over the years, QA is something more like what in manufacturing we might call QC, quality control. Typically, the way this goes is you have a project, you do all your requirements gathering, you do your design, you do all your coding, and then what you coded goes over to a different group of people called QA, and they manually test it. And the developers then are just there to be responsive to whatever QA tells them is wrong. Typically, they're not supposed to be building new features, which, by the way, is the one thing I like about that model, is that developers are not developing new features. They are just being responsive to what QA is sending them back. But due to time pressure, typically it doesn't work this way. Usually developers are also trying to slam out those last few features. Typically, QA has been given a very, very short window to test an entire system because the bulk of the estimate that was wrong to begin with was taken up by coding. Now QA has a very short window to do what they need to do. And most of the time, all they're really able to test is, does this even work? Because developers are coding, and as soon as code is ready, then they flag it for QA. And the developer may have done virtually no testing. Maybe not even it works on my machine level testing. That's somebody else's job, right? And so QA oftentimes is spending their week or 2 days or however much they have for testing, just verifying that things even work, much less being able to do more exploratory testing, looking at edge cases, thinking of ways that users might use the system that were not intended by the developers or foreseen by the stakeholders. They're not able to do any of that stuff. They're just making it work. Well, when we start looking at agile projects, well, now we fixed all these problems, right? I don't think so. In fact, we may have traded one set of problems for another set of problems if this is the way that we do QA. So now we have an agile team, right? So we don't have, a distinct phase where we do all of the coding and then stop, and then all of that code goes over the fence to this group of people to do QA. What happens in a lot of agile teams is, we are pushing out these small batches of functionality, and those small batches are flowing into QA. Structurally, though, and philosophically, we're not really doing anything different. The only difference is now we are streaming small batches to QA to test instead of big batches for QA to test. And generally speaking, developers are continuing to do feature work while QA is doing their testing. And this is why I say, I think that if we are continuing to do what we have traditionally called QA in software development, if we're continuing to do that, but now just in a small batch format in our agile teams, I think really we've just traded waterfall problems for a new set of problems, because we've still created a silo. We still have created a handoff. We've still demarcated it's this group's responsibility to write code. It's this group's responsibility to test. And now that QA is getting it in small batches, that can create some real tensions for QA's workflow, right? Because a lot of the time, these small batches of functionality that we're pushing out, they have to work together. And QA is now having to retest and retest and retest and retest the same things over and over. So much so that a lot of QA teams that I know on Agile teams won't even test like an individual user story or an individual card. They will wait for them to batch up on purpose just so they don't have to keep retesting the same cards over and over and over and over again. Another thing that tends to happen on these teams is the way QA defects are handled, because remember, developers are continuing to chug along, right? We're iterative now. And so developers are continuing to code new features while QA is finding issues with the features that have moved further downstream. So how do you deal with that? How do you work that into your workflow? Should developers stop whatever they're working on to hop over and deal with whatever QA is hung up on now and then go back to what they were working on? That doesn't sound great. Should developers just get around to the stuff that QA sends back whenever they get around to it? I mean, that might work. There are some potential problems with that. Do we create a card on our board called QA defects, and we just add stuff that QA finds and the card never dies because it is continually being fed with stuff that QA is finding? That doesn't sound great either. I think in a workflow like that, the best thing you can do is if you have finished coding on a card and a QA group is now QAing that card, the best thing you can do is have that developer not develop anymore. Wait and be responsive to QA or your team, right? Be responsive to QA. Don't keep going with new features, because otherwise you're going to have to figure out how to inject that into your workflow. It's going to be a constant interruption and bottleneck for both groups, really. So that's kind of what QA looks like in sort of regular, traditional kind of waterfall software development teams. And now as we transition into an agile way of working, but still kind of keeping the same QA paradigm. So what I would like to ask you, dear listeners, is are we even doing the right activity here when we're thinking about what QA is for? Because I think even to this day, if you talk to most organizations that are doing software development, you say, what does QA do? Probably the big thing they're thinking about is manual testing. They may think other things as well, but that's probably the first thing that comes to mind. And that's what kind of defines that job. But I don't know that that is good. I don't know that that's the right activity for QA people to be doing, or at least focusing on, right? Now, I do want to start out, there is sometimes lively discussion about whether there is value in having human beings manually test your system or not, whether we should just set up all automated tests. We got a CD pipeline that's super fast. So, if anybody finds bugs, we can fix them super easy. And now we don't need human beings to manually test our application. And for certain contexts, I think that's probably true, right? As long as you can responsively get out a bug fix or a correction or an adjustment very quickly, depending on what the software does, that may be fine. That may, in fact, be the most efficient thing you can do. However, I think for a lot of projects, there is value in having human beings work with your application before going fully live or going fully into production with the increment that you've added to your product. The reason why I think that is because, human beings know how people misuse the system, or they will intuitively misuse your system. And developers, especially the developers who have coded the system, those things are not going to occur to them, right? It's sort of like proofreading your own work. Like, yeah, you'll catch some errors, but a lot of errors are going to slide under your radar because you wrote it, right? And you know what you meant to spell, and your brain is going to cover up those errors and fill in all the gaps because you know what you wrote. Whereas if someone else is looking at it, they may give you a lot of feedback that didn't even occur to you, right? Like, oh, I can't believe I misspelled that. Or, yeah, I didn't know frillion wasn't a real number. There's all these things will come up that you can adjust to. And I do think there is value in doing that. I don't think having a dedicated QA department that just does manual testing is the only or even the best way to do that. Users can also do that, right? Or stakeholders can also do that. If your team does regularly cadenced demos, my teams usually do, one thing that I like to do is when we do the demo, have an actual user come up and perform the tasks. So we tell them, hey, here's a feature we added, go ahead. And then we watch them, and do they struggle? Do they have a hard time finding where that task is in the navigation? Do the screens make any sense to them? Is it intuitive? Or can they do it very quickly and easily and fluidly? Man, even if they don't say a word, that gives us a ton of useful feedback just watching how they struggle or don't with what we've built. So there's all kinds of ways to have human beings serve as kind of a judgment check. Human beings are creative. We're gonna hack the system. We're gonna use the notes field for something that should actually be in an actual field. We're gonna take paths through the application that our developers might not have anticipated. There's going to be edge cases that occur in the business that might not have been discussed with the developers, or the developers didn't really think of as they were coding. So I do think there's value in having human beings in your testing process somewhere to some extent. It's just there's a lot of ways to get that done. But having said that, I want to make very clear that we live in a day and age when the overwhelming bulk of the testing component of quality of your application should be automated. Now, there are different kinds of tests and there are different ways to automate those tests, right? So for example, as we are coding out the application, we are using unit tests to kind of drive that out, right? So we've got a good suite of automated tests around the behaviors of our code. And we can write those tests at the UI level in most frameworks nowadays to sort of isolate the UI level from the middle tier. Given that this JSON response comes back, how do we expect the UI to behave? We can write those kinds of unit tests for the UI as well. So we should have those, and those can be automated. A lot of our integration level tests around things like API endpoints, a lot of times we can build up a scripted suite of those and automate those. And even our end-to-end testing, where we start at the user interface and we perform tasks and we expect certain outcomes, most, if not all of those tests can be automated as well. And what you want to do is you want this to be the bulk of your testing efforts, because when your tests are automated, then you can start running them throughout your CD checkpoints, right? So, when you are integrating code in the dev server, for example, you might run all the unit tests to see if this commit is going to break anything or not. But maybe at that stage, you don't run all of the end-to-end tests, right? But as the CD pipeline migrates that code, as you get closer to production, that now you might start adding additional levels of rigor, right? Or additional kinds of testing. Those are decisions that you have to make, what makes sense for your environment. But that's the beauty of having those tests. And once they're automated, you don't have to write them again. You don't have to keep recreating it. A human being doesn't have to keep doing manual, quote unquote, regression testing, because your automated test suite is already there. And of course, there's other benefits we get to. Those test suites serve as documentation. They serve as examples of how the code should be used, of the behaviors that we expect in the system. And that documentation is always kept up to date, because if we make changes that break tests, then we either need to do something different with our code, or we need to update the test to reflect the new behaviors that the system should have. I realize that topic in and of itself is probably worth a podcast, because there's a lot of things we could talk about when it comes to automated tests, all the way from tooling to the objections that people have about writing those tests to, should you have 100% automated coverage or not? There's all kinds of issues that go into that. And maybe that's something I'll delve into in another episode if I haven't already at some point in the past. But I just want to make that point that when you have QA, the bulk of their job should not be manual testing. Your automated test suite should cover most, if not all of that. Now, that doesn't mean that your QA people can't be exploring things like weird edge cases or making judgment calls on usability that maybe a machine might have a hard time determining. Most machines aren't going to be able to tell, like, hey, that red and orange color scheme is really unappealing, or, yeah, this is a little hard to read at this alpha opacity. It sometimes takes human beings to be able to do things like that. So that the manual testing and feedback by a human being is always going to be part of most of your flows. But again, the bulk of that needs to be automated and integrated into your CD pipeline. So if we take most of that out of QA's job, then what should these people be doing? I would argue that quality assurance's job is mostly about strategy and tactics around quality for your team and for your organization. What does quality even mean in your context? Does it mean a certain amount of bugs or less end up in production? Does it mean, that you're getting really good net promoter scores on user satisfaction? What does quality mean in terms of this product and this organization and this set of users? And then once we figured that out, what are our strategy and tactics around assuring that those things are good, that those things that we're looking at stay in the green, right? A big part of that is, where are we at with our automated test suite, right? A lot of organizations don't have a great automated test suite, or it's not incorporated into a CD pipeline. And so, how fast can we fix things? How early can we detect defects, or how early can we detect that the system is no longer behaving as expected? How is our unit test suite doing? What integration tests, if any, do we have? How about end-to-end tests? And are we load testing? Is that something that's relevant to this product? All the different kinds of testing, QA can see how healthy we are in each of those categories and help us chart out a path to improvement and be advocates for having the time to make those improvements and being able to articulate to the business the costs and the savings that we can have when we start to look at quality as an overall strategy that affects every part of the development process. And that is a very valuable activity. It's something that people always need to be paying attention to, right? And the nice thing about it is, as soon as we put QA in that position, where they don't have this little niche in the pipeline towards the end, but now they're looking at the entirety of the pipeline. Now, quality and assuring that we have quality is something they're paying attention to. And that's something that has impact all through our value stream. It impacts the way we gather and track what needs to be built, requirements and analysis and user stories and all that. It impacts what the developers are doing. Are we doing TDD? Are we pairing? Are we mobbing? Is that something that's going to help increase our quality? Well, what won't, right? It obviously affects the testing of code, right? And it even affects the way in which we deploy, the frequency in which we deploy, and the size of our deployments. These are all things that would fall under the purview of someone who is trying to assure that we have quality. What state is our quality execution in as we look at each of these areas? And what's the roadmap forward? How do we have a culture of testing and quality at all stages of the development process? And how do we bring that voice into all stages of the development process? A lot of times in organizations, QA is not part of requirements discussions or user story refinement or whatever. They kind of get told what we're building, but they weren't a part of talking about what we were going to build. Is that a good solution? What kind of usability things might we run into? What level of impact and effort will that have? A lot of times developer teams talk about what stories are going to take a long time, what stories are probably going to go pretty fast. Very rarely do developers take into account the amount of testing that needs to be done because of the impact of a particular change. And even, why does that change have such high impact, right? Is it because it has to, or is it just because we haven't written our code in a way that makes change easy? We haven't written our tests in a way that makes change easy. Our tests should be making change easy. They shouldn't be a barrier to change. They should be helping us change safely, right? So, in my opinion, those kinds of things should occupy the vast majority of QA's time. They are like product management for quality, right? That's what they're looking at. I mean, what does product management do, right? They're doing research. They are coming up with the roadmap. They're talking to stakeholders. They're talking to the business. They're making sure we have alignment. They're articulating the costs and benefits of different choices, and they're making decisions about where the product is going and what's going in and what's not, and what's the best way to execute that. Who are the people that we need to do that? And is the product healthy? Just think of somebody doing that, except on the quality assurance side, and paying attention to your strategy and tactics. What are your testing plans? What is your quality plan? What does it even mean to say quality is good, right? What are you measuring? What is your data? What are your triggers for saying that quality is good or quality is in trouble? I mean, we all kind of have a gut feel for it, but what does it specifically mean? What do we observe when quality is good or not? And have we built strategies and tactics around making sure that those things are good, that those metrics stay in the green, right? And this is an evolutionary process, and it's unique to every organization, but many times it's also unique to each individual product. Potentially, it's even unique to each team, at least at some level, right? And so that's the role that I think QA plays in an agile world. Should they get completely out of some kind of manual interaction with the product and giving you feedback on the product before it hits production? I don't know that we're ever gonna eliminate that, at least for every single kind of product, right? And having someone who is not the developer who wrote the app use the app and give feedback on quality is very valuable, right? And it's very valuable to have a human being do that. But we don't want to make QA the manual testing department. That shows that we have some weaknesses and some dysfunctions in our process, even much, much further upstream. So I would encourage you to think about that. And if you have a QA person or a QA group, start thinking about what it might take to start evolving that discipline into something where quality assurance is actually, I know this is crazy, assuring that we have quality in our process, as opposed to just making sure that we aren't putting bugs into production. So I hope that's at least thought-provoking. And there's not one model or blueprint that's going to work the same way for every organization, but be thinking about that. Think about quality as everyone's job, right? It impacts the entire value stream. Testing is something that impacts the entire value stream. Everything that a portion of the stream produces to move downstream can be measured against tests and quality that are appropriate to that stage of transformation. So be thinking about migrating your QA department into providing value there, as opposed to paying people to do the same manual tests over and over. And I think that you will see not only your quality, but also your production and the efficiency of production and the rate of deployment and responsiveness will climb as well. And at the end of the day, isn't that what agility is all about? Increasing our responsiveness. I think QA has a very important role to play in. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.